Margaret Hollis stood silently in front of her late husband Samuel's casket, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The funeral home was filled with people, their somber faces a blur in her peripheral vision as she focused on the empty chair at the front of the room. Samuel had always sat there. He'd sat there for 32 years, morning after morning, reading the paper, sharing small moments over coffee, laughing at their private jokes. Now, that chair was empty, and so was her heart. She wasn't ready to say goodbye. No one could ever truly be. The doorbell rang, jolting her out of her thoughts. The florists had arrived. Then the caterers. And soon after, Richard's colleagues, people who had known her son, Ethan, since he was a boy. They had all come to pay their respects, but none of them mentioned Ethan, not yet. Margaret, standing in her black dress, clutching her phone, walked into the living room to receive a call. She didn't expect it to be from Ethan. "Mom," Ethan's voice sounded strained, the way it always did when he was trying to sound too casual. "Vanessa's birthday party is today. I'm going to that instead of the funeral. I mean, Dad's gone, right? I don't need to be there, and it's just, a lot of people. I'm not really up for it." Margaret's chest tightened as she tried to steady her breath. It wasn't the first time Ethan had disappointed her, but it was the first time she realized just how much distance had grown between them. She fought the urge to argue, but before she could say anything, Ethan hung up. The silence in the room seemed to echo louder than ever. It wasn't like Ethan to abandon his family this way, especially not in the wake of such a profound loss. For a moment, Margaret wished for the son she used to know, the one who had smiled with excitement when he'd first taken an interest in the family business, the one who had asked his father for advice about everything. That boy had vanished years ago, replaced by someone who seemed far more interested in instant gratification and flashing a perfectly manicured lifestyle than carrying on the legacy Samuel had worked so hard to build. But it was the will, more than anything, that would change everything. As Margaret walked slowly toward the study, where Samuel had spent so many hours working on papers, she found herself staring at the letter Samuel had left for her. She hadn't been able to bring herself to open it until now, but something told her this letter would hold the answers she needed. Sitting in Samuel's old leather chair, she broke the seal and unfolded the letter. It was written in Samuel's familiar, neat handwriting. "My dearest Margaret, if you're reading this, then you know what has happened. This is the hardest decision I've ever made, but I trust your judgment, as always. There is one thing I need to tell you about Ethan. Over the past few years, I've watched him grow more detached from the family's work, more consumed by his own ambitions. It pains me to admit it, but I can no longer leave him in charge of what we built together. I know you have always been the backbone of this family. I trust that you'll make the right decisions in the coming days, for both you and Ethan. If he can prove himself worthy, if he can prove he still understands the value of hard work, then I leave it to you, Margaret, to decide what he deserves. I leave everything to you now, my love, knowing that you will make the decisions that will protect our legacy. With all my love, Samuel." Margaret stared at the words, the weight of her husband's trust settling heavily on her. Ethan was being tested, whether he knew it or not. The company, their life's work, was in her hands now. It was her responsibility to decide whether or not Ethan would inherit everything Samuel had built. But there was more. Ethan's future was no longer just about the family business. It was about the man he had become. As she sat there, the noise from outside seemed to blur into the background. She felt the ache of Samuel's absence, but she also felt something else, something akin to resolve. Samuel had always believed in second chances, but he had never been one to give them without a reason. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time in years, Margaret felt a clarity she hadn't expected. She would do what was right, even if it meant she had to make the hardest decision of her life. The funeral continued downstairs, but Margaret knew she wasn't just saying goodbye to her husband today. She was about to step into a role that Samuel had known she would take on when the time came. And now, the decision lay in her hands. The house was filled with the mournful hum of conversation, punctuated by the occasional clink of glass or a hushed laugh in the distance. Margaret stood by the window, watching the gathering outside, people who had come to honor Samuel but whose faces had become unfamiliar over the years. Ethan should have been there, standing next to her, carrying the legacy of his father's hard work. Instead, he was somewhere in Miami, drinking champagne by a pool, living a life that seemed worlds away from the reality of the family business. She was still holding Samuel's letter, the weight of his words bearing down on her. For the first time in a long time, Margaret felt the stirrings of a plan forming in her mind. She knew she couldn't let Ethan take over the family business in the state he was in. He had proven time and time again that he wasn't ready. But as much as it pained her, she didn't want to completely give up on him either. Samuel had believed in second chances, and she could do no less. The front door opened with a creak, and she turned to see her best friend and Samuel's longtime business partner, David Caldwell, stepping inside. David had been there for Samuel through thick and thin, always offering sound advice when things got tough. He'd been a steady presence in their lives, the one person who seemed to know exactly what needed to be done. "Margaret," David greeted her softly, walking over with a comforting hand on her shoulder. "I know this is hard, but I think we need to talk about the future." His voice held the kind of calm certainty that made Margaret feel both grateful and uneasy. She nodded, her throat tight. "Everything's changed, David," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Samuel's gone, and now, I don't know what to do with Ethan." David sat down beside her, his eyes sympathetic. "I know you love him, Margaret, but there comes a time when we have to stop enabling people, even if they are our family. Ethan has shown time and again that he isn't ready to carry this company forward." Margaret nodded, but the words still didn't sit well with her. "He's my son. I know he's made mistakes, but he's also capable of so much more. He has the potential to be someone better, someone who can lead this company." Her voice caught on the last words, as though she were trying to convince herself as much as she was trying to convince David. David gave her a long, thoughtful look. "And what about you, Margaret? Do you think Ethan can change?" The question hung in the air between them. Margaret didn't know how to answer it. All she could think about was the man who had shown up at her door 2 months ago, her son, who had become a stranger to her. The last time she had seen him, Ethan had been dismissive, his eyes distracted by a world that seemed more glamorous than anything Samuel had ever built. "I want to believe he can," she said finally, "but I can't just hand him everything, not if he hasn't earned it." David nodded, his face grave. "Then you need to make him prove it, make him work for it. If he truly cares about this legacy, he'll show you. But if he doesn't, you'll have your answer." Margaret knew he was right. Ethan had to prove he understood what it meant to build something, to work hard for it. Samuel had trusted her, and she couldn't let that trust go to waste. But how would she make him prove it? The next few days were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and arrangements. Ethan had returned home on Tuesday evening, looking every bit the entitled young man she had grown accustomed to. He had barely glanced at her, and his first words were about how inconvenient everything was. "Mom, the house is so empty without Dad. I don't know how you're dealing with this." It was as if the funeral had been nothing more than an inconvenience to him, a momentary pause in his comfortable, selfish life. By Wednesday evening, Margaret had made her decision. She invited Ethan over for dinner, hoping that this conversation would be the one that finally changed everything. Nathan, Ethan's old childhood friend, had come by earlier, his presence reminding Margaret of the young man Ethan used to be, the one who worked hard for what he wanted and didn't take things for granted. Maybe it wasn't too late to get that version of Ethan back. When Ethan arrived, he seemed distracted, his phone still buzzing in his pocket. Margaret knew that this moment wasn't going to be easy. She had to be firm. She had to make him see. "Ethan," she began, her voice steady. "I've been thinking a lot about what's next, about the company, about your future." Ethan looked up, startled. "What about it?" "I'm not going to hand you everything just because you think you deserve it," she said, her gaze unwavering. "You've made too many mistakes, and I'm tired of watching you waste opportunities." Ethan's face reddened, but he didn't speak. He wasn't used to being confronted like this. "I'm giving you one chance," Margaret continued, her words clear and final. "You're going to start from the ground up. You're going to work with Nathan, and you're going to show me that you understand what it means to earn your place here. If you can prove that you've learned, then I'll consider what's next. But no more handouts, no more excuses." Ethan opened his mouth to argue, but Margaret held up a hand. "I've made up my mind. You don't get to decide this. I'm not giving up on you, but I need you to prove to me and to Samuel that you can handle what's been given to you." There was a long silence. Ethan's eyes flickered with uncertainty, and for the first time in a long time, Margaret saw a glimmer of the sun she used to know. "I'll prove it," Ethan said quietly, the weight of her words sinking in. "I'll show you. I'll show you that I'm capable." Margaret nodded, but deep inside, she knew this was just the beginning. Ethan's journey was far from over, and maybe, just maybe, this was the first step toward the redemption she had been hoping for. But one thing was certain, this time she wasn't going to let him fail without trying. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of tension, strategy, and small victories. Ethan, once the spoiled and entitled son, was suddenly thrust into a reality that demanded his full attention. Margaret could see it in his eyes, the confusion, the resistance, but also a flicker of determination. He was trying, but the road to redemption was steep, and every step was going to be harder than the last. Ethan had moved into a small apartment just a few blocks away, a decision Margaret hadn't expected. It seemed like he was genuinely trying to sever his dependence on his old lifestyle, the one that revolved around Vanessa, parties, and entitlement. But Margaret knew better than to think this was the end of the story. Old habits died hard. That Friday afternoon, Ethan arrived at the office for his first day on the job, and Margaret watched him from her desk, noting how out of place he looked. He was dressed in an expensive suit, far too polished for a man about to learn how to truly run a business. His hands fidgeted with the cufflinks as if he were trying to find comfort in something familiar. Margaret didn't have time for niceties. She called him into her office, her face set in determination. "Sit down, Ethan," she said, her voice firm. "We're starting from the bottom. You'll be shadowing Nathan for the next few weeks. I expect you to ask questions, take notes, and learn how this business runs. Not from the top, but from the ground up." Ethan opened his mouth, ready to protest, but Margaret held up her hand. "Don't even try. You've made it clear what you think of this company and what it represents. Now you're going to show me you can respect it, starting with Nathan." Nathan had been running the operation since Samuel's passing, and he had proved to be both steady and diligent. He had worked his way up from the lowest position, and his heart was in the right place. Nathan was the only one Ethan could learn from now, and Margaret hoped it would teach her son more than just how to manage a company. She hoped it would teach him humility. Ethan sat down, looking sullen but resigned. He wasn't used to being told what to do, let alone by his own mother. "Fine," he muttered, looking out the window as though trying to escape the situation. Nathan entered the room, his face neutral but his eyes warm as he glanced at his old friend. "You ready for this?" he asked, his voice carrying a mix of encouragement and skepticism. Ethan didn't answer, but he stood, following Nathan out of the office without a word. Margaret watched them leave, feeling a strange mixture of hope and doubt. This wasn't going to be easy for any of them. The next few weeks were a blur of early mornings, late nights, and uncomfortable silences between mother and son. Ethan seemed to resent every task Nathan handed him, from sorting through paperwork to attending meetings with potential clients. Every step was a struggle. He complained, he sulked, and he made every effort to cut corners. But Nathan, ever the patient teacher, refused to give him an inch. The turning point came one afternoon when they were working on a new deal that could potentially secure the future of the business. The company had been under financial strain for some time, and this contract was essential. Nathan was busy reviewing numbers when he noticed Ethan's lack of focus, his eyes darting around the room, constantly distracted by his phone. "Ethan," Nathan said, his tone more serious than it had been in days. "This isn't a joke. We're at a critical point, and your behavior isn't just frustrating, it's damaging." Ethan snapped his head up, his pride igniting. "I'm doing my best, all right. I'm not you. I didn't grow up in this world, Nathan. This isn't my fault. It doesn't matter how you got here," Nathan replied, stepping closer. "What matters is that you're here now, and if you want to prove anything to your mother, to this company, to yourself, you need to start taking responsibility. The time for excuses is over." For a moment, Ethan was silent, his defiance flickering. Then, almost as if he couldn't hold it back any longer, he slammed his hand on the desk. "You don't get it, Nathan. I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask for all of this pressure. You think I'm just going to magically step in and save the day? You think I can be the man my father was?" He looked down, his face flushed with emotion. "I'm not him." Nathan stood still, absorbing the weight of Ethan's words. "No," he said quietly. "You're not. But that doesn't mean you can't try. You're capable of more than this. But it starts with understanding what you're willing to lose and what you're willing to fight for." Ethan's face was a storm of emotions. Guilt, frustration, and something else Margaret hadn't seen in him for a long time, vulnerability. For a moment, she wondered if this was the son she had been waiting to see for all these years. It wasn't long after that day that things began to change. Ethan started showing up earlier, leaving later, and for the first time he actually seemed engaged. He asked questions, took notes, and although it wasn't easy, he began to listen. One evening, as they were leaving the office, Ethan turned to Nathan, his expression more composed than it had been in weeks. "I didn't understand it before. I get it now. You don't just get what you want in this life. You have to earn it. No shortcuts, no quick fixes." Nathan nodded, offering a small smile. "It's a long road, Ethan, but you're getting there." Margaret watched from the doorway of her office, a quiet smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. She hadn't expected miracles. But this felt like progress. Ethan was changing slowly, and though she wasn't naive enough to believe it was over, she couldn't deny that a new spark had ignited in him. As Ethan headed out the door with Nathan, Margaret took a deep breath, feeling a sense of peace settle in her chest. It wasn't perfect, but maybe, just maybe, they were on the right track. And for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to hope. The following months were a blur of progress, but with each step Ethan took forward, Margaret couldn't help but feel like they were walking on a tightrope. Her son, the one who had squandered his inheritance, was finally showing signs of change. But there was always a nagging doubt in the back of her mind. Could Ethan truly rise to the challenge, or was he simply biding his time, playing the part of the dutiful son until he got what he wanted? Ethan's work ethic had improved, but there were moments of weakness. He would slip into old habits, trying to take shortcuts, relying too heavily on Nathan's guidance, or dismissing his mother's decisions as outdated. Margaret had to remind herself almost daily that old patterns weren't easy to break. But despite these setbacks, she saw something new in him, a flicker of genuine determination. Maybe it wasn't enough yet, but it was a start. It was a Thursday afternoon when things finally came to a head. Nathan was away, working with clients on an expansion project, and Margaret was alone in the office, going over financial reports. Her phone buzzed with a message from David Caldwell, one of Richard's oldest friends and most trusted business partners. David had always been a steady force in the company, the man who had backed Richard through thick and thin. And it seemed, the man who had a vested interest in Margaret's decision-making now that Richard was gone. The message was short, direct, and chilling. "Margaret, we need to talk. Meet me at the office. It's urgent." A cold sense of dread settled in her stomach. She had learned over the years that urgency in business was rarely a good thing. She grabbed her purse and left the office, not bothering to lock the door. The weight of the unknown hung heavily on her shoulders, each step echoing in her mind like a warning. David was already waiting in his office when Margaret arrived. His expression was serious, his usually calm demeanor replaced with something darker, more intense. "Margaret," he began, "I've been keeping something from you. I didn't want to worry you, but I think it's time you know the truth." Margaret felt her pulse quicken. "What truth?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. David leaned forward, his hands resting on the edge of his desk. "There's been talk around the company. Some of the board members are getting restless. They're questioning your ability to lead the business. And worse, they're wondering if it might be time to sell." Margaret's stomach turned. She had known there would be people who would try to undermine her, but hearing it from David, someone she had trusted for years, made it feel more real and more dangerous. "Sell," she repeated, trying to steady herself. "This company is my family's legacy. It's not for sale." "I know," David said, his voice low. "But there's a problem, Margaret. Some of the board members believe that that he's not ready. They want someone with more experience, someone who can move the company into the future. They've been looking at outside investors, people who can help them secure the future, and I'm afraid they might not take no for an answer." Margaret felt the weight of the situation sink in. Her mind raced. The company was at a critical crossroads. She had no intention of giving up, but the pressure was mounting from every angle. People were already trying to manipulate her son. Could she trust Ethan, or was he being swept into something darker than she could control? "Have you spoken to Ethan about this?" Margaret asked, her voice tight with concern. David hesitated. "I've been talking to him." "He's still unsure about everything, Margaret, but I don't think he fully understands the consequences of his decisions. Some of the investors are already circling. They're willing to offer him a deal, and they're promising him control if you'll just step aside." Margaret's heart sank. She knew exactly what this was, another play for control, a game of power and greed that had already taken too much from her family. She looked David in the eye, searching for any trace of the loyalty he had once shown her. But all she saw was a man trying to distance himself from the mess that was coming. "I've had enough of this," Margaret said, her voice cold. "I won't be intimidated, and I won't let anyone, not even my son, tear this company apart." David shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Margaret, you don't understand. These people are serious. They've got the connections, the money, the influence. You need to be careful." Margaret stood, her decision clear. "I've made my choice, and it's not one that involves selling or stepping down. If Nathan wants to help rebuild this company, then he's going to have to prove it, and he'll have to do it on his own merit, not by throwing his mother under the bus." David didn't argue, but his face was grim. "I hope you know what you're doing," he said quietly, as if he knew the storm that was coming. Later that evening, Margaret sat alone in Richard's study, staring at the family photo on the desk. The weight of the decision ahead of her was heavy, but it wasn't the fear that gripped her heart. It was the deep sense of responsibility. This company wasn't just about wealth, it was about legacy. It was about the hard work and sacrifice Richard had poured into it for decades. And now it was up to her. To protect it, to guide Ethan, and to ensure the family didn't fall victim to the greed that had already consumed so many others. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. She was ready. And this time, she wasn't going to let anyone, not even her son, take away what Richard had worked so hard to build. The next morning, Margaret called Ethan into her office. It was time for the conversation that would change everything. When Ethan arrived, his expression was guarded. "Mom," he said, sitting down in front of her desk, "David said you wanted to talk." Margaret looked at her son, feeling a mix of frustration and hope. "Ethan, I need you to listen to me carefully. There's something going on in this company, and I need to know where you stand. You can't keep running away from responsibility." Ethan swallowed hard. "What do you mean? I've been working, I'm trying." "No," Margaret interrupted, her voice sharp. "You're not trying enough. You've been given a chance, a real one, to lead this company, to prove yourself. But if you think I'm just going to hand over control, you're mistaken." Ethan's eyes widened, a flicker of panic passing over his face. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that the company is in danger. People are circling, Ethan. They want to take control. Some of them think you'll sell us out. And I need to know if you're going to be part of that, or if you're going to stand with me and protect this family legacy." Ethan was silent for a long moment, his gaze shifting between the photo of Richard and the heavy weight of his mother's words. Then finally he spoke, his voice steady but raw. "I won't sell out, not this time. I'll prove to both of you, that I'm capable." Margaret's heart clenched as she realized just how much had changed. This wasn't the boy she had raised. This wasn't the entitled young man who had been willing to let everything slip through his fingers. This was a man who was finally ready to fight for what was his. And for the first time in years, Margaret believed in him. In the weeks that followed, Ethan's transformation became evident. He woke up early, stayed late, and began making decisions that were bold yet calculated. Margaret watched him closely, knowing the stakes were higher than ever. The company's future, their family legacy, was on the line. If Ethan couldn't prove himself now, there would be no second chance. Nathan, still reeling from the humiliation of being disinherited, had thrown himself into the work with an intensity Margaret hadn't seen before. He spent long hours in the office, poring over old contracts and looking into new opportunities, showing a level of commitment she had feared would never come. But despite the progress, there was still tension. Every day, Ethan struggled to shed the weight of his past mistakes, his failed businesses, his arrogance, his easy reliance on inheritance. Margaret knew this was a delicate balance. Ethan's successes were promising, but they were still fragile, and the threats to the business were growing more urgent. Tom Morrison's group had been circling the company like vultures, and now a more insidious enemy was closing in. The day everything changed began like any other, with a knock on the door. "Margaret," David Caldwell said, his voice colder than usual as he entered her office uninvited. The door clicked shut behind him, and Margaret stood, her hand gripping the back of the chair. "I need to speak with you," David continued, his eyes not meeting hers as he crossed the room. "It's about Nathan." Margaret felt her stomach tighten. "What about him?" he asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. David looked uncomfortable, but there was a sharpness in his tone that didn't belong to the kind, steady man she had once trusted. "I've been hearing rumors. Tom Morrison's been asking about him, about his financial situation. They're worried about the company's stability, Margaret. If Nathan can't prove his worth soon, they'll use him as a pawn, and that could destroy everything." Margaret's pulse quickened. "You think Nathan's ready?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. David looked at her, then nodded. "He's trying, but there are still some deep-seated issues. He's not the same person he was before. But that doesn't mean he's completely capable either. And there's someone else who's circling, someone closer than you think." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. "What are you saying?" David hesitated. "I think you need to act quickly. You can't leave him in control of the company, not yet. There's a better way, a better person to help protect what Richard built." Margaret stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. She realized then that this wasn't just about the business anymore. This was about power, control, and betrayal. David had been setting her up just as much as anyone else. He wasn't concerned about the company's future. He was concerned about his own. "You've been playing both sides, haven't you?" Margaret said, her voice suddenly sharp with realization. David's eyes flickered with guilt, but he quickly masked it with a cold smile. "Margaret, you've always been like family to me, but this is bigger than you. This is about survival." Margaret stood taller, the fire in her eyes now matched by the resolve in her heart. "No, David, this is about loyalty, and you've shown me none." David's smile faltered, but he turned and headed for the door. "You'll regret this, Margaret, trust me." But Margaret didn't regret a thing. She'd already seen enough to know that David wasn't the man she thought he was. He had been playing a long game, manipulating her into trusting him, and now it was time to end it. The next day, Margaret sat down with Ethan. The weight of what was to come pressed heavily on her shoulders, but she knew it was time to lay all the cards on the table. "Ethan," she began, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside. "We've been fighting a war for control of this company, and it's not just about us anymore. There are people who want to take it from us, from you, from your father's legacy." Ethan, who had been quieter than usual that day, sat forward, his eyes sharp with curiosity. "Who?" "David," Margaret said, her voice low. "And Tom Morrison. They've been planning to take over for months now, pretending to be on our side. But they've been using you to do it." Ethan's eyes widened. "You're saying David's been working against us all along?" Margaret nodded. "Yes, he's been manipulating the situation, trying to make you feel like you're not ready. But the truth is, he never wanted you to take control. He wants to take everything Richard built for himself." Ethan looked at her, his face a mask of disbelief. "Why would he do that?" "For the same reason anyone would. Power, money, control. It's all about what he can get from this company, and he's willing to throw us all under the bus to get it." Ethan stood up, a surge of anger flooding through him. "We can't let that happen, not after everything Dad did." Margaret watched her son, her heart heavy but filled with something else too, pride. "No, we won't. But you have to prove yourself, Ethan. I can't protect you forever. You have to take the lead." The next few days were a whirlwind of meetings, strategy, and confrontation. Ethan, now fully committed to the fight, reached out to the remaining loyalists in the company. Together, they devised a plan to push back against the takeover attempts. Margaret had never seen him so focused, so determined. But it wasn't just about business anymore. It was about standing for what was right. The final confrontation came on a Friday afternoon, in the middle of a tense meeting with Tom Morrison and his group of investors. The room was filled with cold, calculating men and women, all with their eyes on the prize, a prize that didn't belong to them. Ethan stood at the head of the table, his voice calm but unwavering. "I'm not selling," he said, his gaze cutting through the room. "This company belongs to my family, and we're not giving it up." Tom's expression remained unchanged, but his eyes narrowed. "We can make this happen, Ethan. You can't win this fight on your own, you'll see." Ethan leaned forward. "I already have, and I'll make sure you regret underestimating me." Margaret stood beside him, her voice steady as she added, "You're not getting anything, Tom. Not this time." For the first time since Richard's death, Margaret felt a surge of victory, tempered with the heavy realization that this was only the beginning. The battle for the company wasn't over yet, but the tide had shifted. Ethan had proven himself, and together they had shown that loyalty, family, and hard work meant more than power and money. And for the first time, Margaret knew they were going to make it. They would rebuild, stronger than before.